I think people are more addicted to cell phones than they were to alcohol. Well, let me just tell you something. And I really hope you don't do this, but driving with a Bluetooth is like driving with a 0.08 blood alcohol content.
Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we're all just trying to survive in a rough world.
So, Carm, not only are you doing the podcast with me, but I've now dragged you into another endeavor. Originally, it was just going to be me writing a book about you, but I'm working with a book coach. Big shout out to Joe Garner, who has not one, not two, not three, but 4 New York Times best-selling books. And he is guiding me, because I was writing kind of stream of consciousness. What has the experience been like over the last 2 sessions, which are basically therapy sessions, where Joe asks you questions? Are you enjoying it or are you hating it?
I enjoy it, but I think I have a problem.
What's the problem?
I think I have attention deficit disorder. I just diagnosed it not long ago for myself.
You 100% have adult attention deficit disorder. As you're growing older, at your 83 years young of age, you are also getting incredibly demanding and bossy, and that is taking a toll on me.
That's a compliment, everybody, because I thought I was always demanding and bossy.
And 3 of every 10 comments, which is 30%, basically yell at me for not being nice enough to you. So now I'm going to take a deep breath and be very nice to you. Carm, we have an incredible show today. The reason I am now pushing you to work on the book as well is you're about to see that you're surrounded by powerful women, and they have written books themselves.
Do you want to help my son? His company, Content Partners Media, specializes in brand video and content creation for innovative companies and others. Please go to www.contentpartnersmedia.com and hire him. I repeat, please go to www.contentpartnersmedia.com.
Welcoming to the show, I believe for the 3rd time, we've got Ruth Markel, who needs no introduction at this point, Dan Markel's mother, and the author of the recently published, out now. Ruth, what is the entire title of the book?
A Mother's Reflection on Murder, Grief, and Trial Life.
And for those who've been living under a rock, as you know, Ruth's son, Dan Markel, a Harvard-educated undergrad and graduate law school law professor, was shot and killed in his Tallahassee driveway in 2014, and we're now awaiting the trial of Charlie Adelson, the ex-brother-in-law of the wife. So you guys all know the story.
Not of the wife. The ex-brother-in-law of the guy.
Yeah, correct. You know, Wendy's brother is what I'm trying to say. The other woman on the show today is Candace Lightner. Candace, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. You know what I was thinking? You have the word light in your name, which is very fitting. I'm sure you've heard that before, right? Because you brought a lot of light to the world. No,
I think it was People Magazine or one of the newspapers sort of did something on the full name, but accenting light. But no, you're the first person to actually bring it up and mention it.
Congratulations.
How do you say light in Hebrew? Or. My niece's name is Leor, my light. So for those of you who don't think you know Candace, you actually do, because unless you've been living on Mars, you've heard of MAD, which is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, founded by the great Candace Lightner. And I went to check out her bio, and you can tell that she is a bit of a whippersnapper, a tough woman, because right off the bat, when I went to Wikipedia, it says, and I quote, "I'm tired of all the misinformation about me on the internet, and Wikipedia kept kicking me off, so I created my own Wikipedia." So a little background on Candace. She is truly a groundbreaking American traffic safety activist. She's an author. Carmela, an author. Ruth is an author. You're soon to be mother of an author.
I am the reader of these people. That's my function.
If you help me enough, I'll give you a byline or whatever they call it on a book. You'll be co-author. Candace is also a spokesperson, widely recognized as one of the most influential American citizens of the 20th century. Let me say that again. One of the most influential American citizens of the 20th century. She founded, as I said, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It was the first national anti-drunk driving movement in the United States. And this all came about in May 1980 or thereafter, after her 13-year-old daughter, Carrie, was killed by a multiple repeat offender who was drunk driving just the day before. Lightner is a recipient, and this goes on for hours, so I'm going to wrap it up, of the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, which is called the Jefferson Award. This organization that she started as a single mother grew to more than 400 chapters across the entire globe, worldwide. We welcome you to the show. How are you?
Thank you. You didn't mention it, but I will. I'm also the founder of We Save Lives, which is the organization that I am managing now.
And I was going to get to that for sure. I have it in my notes, but I'm glad you brought that up. And kids out there, if you think you've accomplished something, you really haven't. So follow Candace's lead. And even if you start something, there's always something else to start. But Ruth, I'm going to, begin with you. I know the great Steve Cohen, our producer, who's obviously in touch with you and Candace, was emailing back and forth. And you said to Steve something along the lines of Candace is an incredible role model, and you were actually really excited. Tell us about that. How did you come to know about Candace, and why is she so important in your life?
I am really thrilled to meet Candace. I have to say that Candace is actually much more than just a role model. Not that there's anything wrong in just a role model, but she's really an inspiration. And Candace's organization comes up in so many different ways. Prior to my own tragedy of 2014, which is the murder, obviously, of Dan, and was terrible, and some subsequent issues, which we'll talk about. But I actually have been very involved in other organizations because I worked in emergency preparedness, I worked in school shootings and other issues. And MAD always comes up as the example. And just to share with you, I had to do something about victims of crime in Canada, which I'll talk about later. And guess what the example of advocacy is? MAD. So MAD has a lot of chapters in Canada as well, from just reading that article. So she is this inspiration, and her name is important. It's in my book, even, I have to tell you, and I've quoted her. I believe Candace said at one point, grief comes in 3 stages. You can correct me, Candace, if I'm wrong. It's very meaningful, which was the beginning of the incident, the beginning of the stage 1, the middle, and it lasts for life, right? And I think that is the truth. And it's very significant, because I think a lot of people working with grief today, remember when you had to think about grief in phases, and you were supposed to go through certain phases, really Kubler-Ross's stuff and so forth, but it's really changed. And I think Candace is really right out there in saying, hey, it's still here today. So meaning you never really push it under the table and so forth, but it's a way of working with the grief as well. So she's actually in the grief category of my own story, somebody who comes up. And then in the advocacy, which is my later events in my life, it happened really only in the last few years, where she's the model for how do you create advocacy, writing bills. And she has multiple interests and groups. I'm still in I would call it, I'm in the embryonic stage, and she certainly has launched to all of the advocacy initiatives. I mean, we certainly did okay. We got the Markel Act passed in Florida for visitation of grandparents. So I am thrilled, and really, you are an inspiration.
I think in the book you mentioned that Candace is a role model of yours. Candace, were you aware of this? Did you know this?
Oh, no, didn't have a clue until you emailed me. Yeah, no, I had no idea. But, I do hear those things every once in a while, or a newspaper clipping. Somebody will send me that said, oh, I want to do what she did or whatever. But, I just don't keep up with that. But no, I was very honored. I actually was, especially if it was helpful to you, Ruth.
No, thank you. I think it does help you, because what your example, first of all, of really, you really moved quickly, unfortunately, after your child's, not murder, I'm in the murder world, after your child's car accident.
No, I'm sorry. I have to stop you. We don't call them accidents. These are choices that people make. There's nothing accidental about them. So after her car crash, after the crime, it's also a crime. Drunk driving is a crime. So any other word but accident, I'll accept. Most any other word, but definitely not accident.
All right, that's wonderful. I stand to be corrected. I actually read somewhere that you actually consider a car crash as homicide, which I'm going to talk about later in terms of homicide survivors and what we go through. But I do want to just say that it's a very relevant contribution, and and the model of how you organize even, I think, is quite interesting. And we want to hear more about how you get all these memberships, how do you get all these chapters all over the world started? Because I think, tell us a little bit, how did it go?
Well, first I need to tell you that MAD is no longer a grassroots chapter organization. They did away with the chapters after I left, and they're definitely not grassroots. They're a bureaucracy of paid staff, more so than volunteers. So there's a difference between MAD now and MAD when I started. So when I started MAD, we were a grassroots organization, primarily volunteers, and we had chapters in almost every state, Canada, several other countries as well. And I never recommend, I'm actually doing a master class, a series of them for the Mentora Institute. I'm doing two. One is on activism and how to be a successful activist that covers a number of issues. And then the other one is how to make a successful movement that moves, because so many movements don't. But I don't recommend organizations starting chapters, because it's really, unless you have a lot of money and can control and monitor the actions of everyone. However, how I did it is not what I would recommend to anybody, and it's not how anybody else does it. But when I started MAD, we had a major press conference, and I think the first one was calling on the governor in California to form a task force to solve. I'm big on solving. I don't like creating awareness. I want to solve what the problem is. So to solve the problem of drunk driving. Well, that article went nationwide, and I started getting phone calls from survivors and victims, and specifically parents, mostly mothers of children who had been killed. And they would be in Pennsylvania or Maryland or whatever. I was in California at the time. And they'd say, I want to do what you're doing. What do we need to do? And I say, start a chapter. You can be a chapter. So, there's no planning, no strategic plan with a lot of long-term thinking. So they said, great. And that's exactly how we got our over 400, it was 450 chapters, is people would contact us and say, I want to start a chapter. And we'd say, fine, start a chapter. Now, eventually, what we had to do was establish policies and all kinds of other stuff, basically, that chapters had to follow in order to remain a chapter. But in the beginning, we didn't. And what is amazing to me is that most of them were started by women. Many of the women had not worked in the workforce before, except worked out of their home. Some had, but most were housewives, women who worked at home. And they did a fabulous job. I never saw so many people just get so immersed in a cause. And, it was the first time they'd had a chance to make some meaning out of their child's death. And in most cases, it was mothers of children who died, although we did have some fathers. What they accomplished in their states and in their communities was absolutely unbelievable, with no experience, kind of like me, with no experience whatsoever, but just with a strong belief in what they were doing was right and needed to be done, and also with passion. And I'm a big believer in passion. If you don't have passion, chances are you're not going to go anywhere. And we all had major passion to stop drunk driving and to reduce deaths and injuries. And we did.
And I just want to jump in here, because the origin of this, the origin story, as they say, is super interesting. So you were actually, I believe, a real estate agent. You were a mother of 3. You had no college education. You were a single mother. And for those who don't know, because I was doing some research on this, and I was born in 1969, so I was a young boy in 1980. Carrie, your daughter, was killed. The person who was arrested was 47-year-old Clarence William Bush. Turns out he had been drunk at the time of the crash, but then you found out that he was arrested for another drunk driving crash the night before he killed your daughter. He was released on bail that same morning, stopped at a neighborhood bar on the way home. He hits and kills Carrie. It was his 5th drunk driving offense in 4 years, and here's the kicker. He was driving with a valid California driver's license when he killed Carrie. Back then, was it a crime to drive drunk? It was a totally different world and a worldview, correct, Candace?
No, it was a crime. It simply was a crime that wasn't enforced. When we went after prison for him, and we looked, and now we didn't have the internet, this is way back in the day, and Google and all these other things, but we couldn't find anybody in the United States at that time in 1980 who had been incarcerated for felony drunk driving. And he didn't go to prison, actually. He went to a halfway house for 16 months, where he was still able to drive his car to and from work, and he was still able to go home on the weekends. Now, I did put a stop to that as soon as I found out that was happening, which was sort of an accident. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known. And actually, even without my intervention, the California legislature did pass a bill at that time they named after my daughter that did take away his license. And it was something like after 3 offenses, your license was removed, but not when he was sentenced. He was still driving on a valid California driver's license. So when I see people today, and I hear a lot from victims constantly, and a lot of them aren't happy because the sentences were 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever. And I understand their frustration, but at the same time, I think back, and Bush was only the 2nd person that we could find in the state of California that was incarcerated as a result of MAD. The first person that was incarcerated was also as a result of MAD. It was another chapter that we had started in Southern California, and that guy was also incarcerated, again, halfway houses. Now, of course, it's all different. They go to prison. They have ignition interlock devices, et cetera, but not in those days. They didn't. It just wasn't enforced.
And amazingly, this wasn't the first time someone in your family was struck by a drunk driver. Is that right?
My son, actually, when he was 4, was run over by a driver on prescription meds. And he was in a coma and has permanent brain injury and a plate where his skull was. And then the twins and my mother were hit by a drunk driver when the twins were about 18 months old. And that ended up being a 3-car collision. And Serena, Carrie's sister, actually was the one injured in that crash, but not seriously. So yeah, that was, we've sort of had a run of car crashes in this family.
But Candace herself was in a car accident, right? You yourself were in an accident. Did I understand?
A crash. Yeah. I was about 7 years ago, which broke my back. And that was a distracted driver. That was actually a nurse and a woman who was on her cell phone and hit me from behind, totaled my car and hers. And it did break my back.
Wow. There's so much to get to here. So I want to get to We Save Lives and then jump into Ruth's story and more of your story. Before that, though, did you ever speak to the person that killed your daughter?
If you ever saw the movie, I had a conversation and met his wife. And we actually were together during the trial. And then, and I did talk to her a number of times afterwards. He had had a number of other crashes, not only that we all know about, but that we didn't know about, that she told me about, that he ended up paying people off, et cetera. So this is true. So he was an alcoholic, and I asked her several times, why didn't you leave him? Well, she didn't work outside the home, and he was the main provider, and she had children, and she wasn't sure she could make it on her own. So I asked her, we started getting letters from wives of alcoholics. And I'm not a wife of an alcoholic, and I don't know what it's like to be one. So I asked her if she would volunteer for us and respond to these letters. And she said yes, and she did. So whenever I would get letters from, family members of alcoholics who wanted to know what to do, I would give them to her, and she would respond. So we did have a kind of a relationship. Him, I was only able to confront him after he killed my daughter and was sentenced to a halfway house. As soon as he got out, he was given his driver's license. And that night, he had another drunk driving crash. He hit a young girl who had the same name as my daughter, Carrie, who was the same age as my daughter would have been had she lived. And it happened within about a mile from where he killed my daughter. And it was big major news because of because it was him and me and whatever. And also because when he was sentenced the first time and the press interviewed him, he said, I'll never do this again. I give my right arm, blah, blah, blah. And then they came to me and I said, mark my words, he will do this again. And he did. So it really was major, major news. So he went to court and the young gal, he didn't kill her or anything. He just injured her and it wasn't serious. And so when I was going to court a couple of years before, I didn't have the opportunity to face him. It wasn't allowed then. We changed that, by the way. But at that time, it wasn't allowed. When he went to court on the latest drunk driving, it was allowed. And Carrie opted to allow me to speak instead of her. So for the first time, I actually was able to go into court, confront him about what he had done to my daughter and what we had suffered as a result.
It's 42 years later now since Carrie's gone. How does the pain compare from then to now?
Oh, it's much different. In fact, I get frustrated and saddened sometimes when I see people posting 10 years later who are still in so much pain. I'm not. Yes, do I have pain? Yes, I go through. In fact, I said to somebody yesterday, I said, I always get kind of maudlin during the holidays and the anniversary of her death or birthday, but it is so much different. It's so much better. And I mean, when it happened with her, I couldn't stop crying. I could go on and on. I mean, it's the worst thing that I think can ever happen to anybody is the death of their child. But I'm just one of these people. And that's why I wrote the book, Giving Sorrow Words, How to Cope with Grief and Get On With Your Life. I am one of these people that I am able to get on with my life, and I have. And so it's just nothing compared to what it was then. And I'm a grief facilitator. And so after, I think it was a Columbine shooting, I went with a friend of mine who does this all the time. I don't, to work with some of the families of that shooting and some other families. And he is one of these amazing people. His daughter was killed in India, I think, in a bus crash. He's a psychologist, and he has the ability to go back into his own pain and really relate to those that he speaks to. And I've actually recommended him to a number of survivors for private counseling. Well, I don't do that. That's not my way of doing things. So anyway, we were sitting in this group. It was a weekend thing. He was taking them back and he was in his pain, and I wasn't. And I frankly have a great sense of humor. And so I have the most wonderful ability to make jokes in the direst of circumstances, which I did. And then he asked them at the end of the day on Saturday, he said, bring a photo of your child tomorrow and let's talk about, some of the things you remember or something. And so the next day he was late and I was there. So I took it on and I said, okay, I want you guys to tell me the funniest things that your kids did or the funniest things that you remember, whatever. And we went around the room and everybody was laughing and whatever. Anyway, he came in and everybody's mood changed and, and so at the end of the session, he said to everybody, what did you think? And without missing a beat, all of them looked at me and said, we want to be like her. Mm-hmm. And I loved that because I like to know that I give people hope to realize that this isn't something that you're going to be in horrible pain for forever. So,
Candace, one of the things I watched the podcast that you did with the Columbia professor.
Oh, Hitandra?
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me was that resonated with me, that in the very beginning you are talking about anger, and I have experienced that. I don't get depressed, I get angry.
Real quick, I just want to point out to the audience, this is, first of all, I have no business being here because I'm surrounded by 3 strong women that can eat me up and chew me out. But and mostly my mother.
And we will.
But my mother has lost a child. Candace has lost a child. Ruth has lost a child. So to Carm's question, and I want to get to Ruth as well, I'm more interested in, well, how you go from anger to advocacy, but also how do you not just sit there and feel sorry for yourself?
Well, wait one second. First of all, just let the facts be out. You mentioned that in the beginning you felt this tremendous anger, and then you mentioned during this podcast, which was recent, that you don't feel that anger anymore.
Well, let me tell you, my anger wasn't at Clarence William Bush. My anger was at the system that allowed and enabled him to continue to drive drunk, that didn't take away his license, that didn't incarcerate him, that didn't hold him accountable. I was more angry at the DAs and the judges and the laws in California than I was at the man who killed my daughter. So I was able to take that anger and do something positive about it. If I had been really angry at him, I suppose if I went and confronted him and told him how I felt, it might have lessened my anger, but that wasn't where my anger was directed. It was directed at the system that failed my daughter miserably. And I've said this, if somebody had done what I did before she was killed, she would still be alive today. So I was able to take that anger and turn it into something very positive. I was able to change the system, which I did, not only in California, but every other state as well. And I'm sure you all know that I was able to change the culture of a nation. These were things that were productive and positive. And so it sort of helped me in lessening my anger. Now, can I still get angry? I can still get angry at certain things. About drunk driving. I get angry when I see, newspaper clippings of people who make stupid choices. I'm on a big kick now of passenger empowerment, and I get angry when I see people killed that are passengers that I think if they'd just spoken up and said something, they wouldn't be dead today. And so I still have other issues, but you're right. But also that anger turned to passion, and it was that passion that kept me going.
Anger is, in my experience, anger is a form of energy, and the passion is related to that energy also. So it was, but I think in your situation, you literally moved mountains. I mean, there is virtually nobody who didn't hear about MAD. You made major changes, but in particular, in my case, I think the Holocaust is way behind me. It's 85 years ago, and then somebody comes and puts a sign on your highway, and my anger just seethes. So.
Well, what do you mean a sign? Like an anti-Semitic
sign?
No,
that Kanye was right. And there was a big sign.
Carmela's referring to after Kanye, while Kanye's stuff was going on.
That just, look, I'm an Arab, and that infuriates the hell out of me. And I think it's, his publicity or whoever, management company had to go out and ask people to boycott him. And I thought, why do they even need to ask? That should have just been automatic, that everybody would discontinue a relationship with him, and I could go on. I get on these soapboxes, but no, I feel the same anger that you do.
Hey, yay, come on the show with Carm, Candace, and Ruth. Ruth, I dare you to do that, yay.
That would be more dangerous than anything else.
Ruth, you're obviously, the freshest victim, unfortunately, dealing with this. I mean, just 8 years ago, and obviously the pain is still very raw, but what is the impact on you and your family from this, sudden violent death?
I think that's really an important point, and I'm going to answer it in two ways. First of all, what they do say about victims is they're the orphans of the justice system. So, so this is in terms of whether you look at it in terms of anger, but I look at it in terms of what has to be built up. Mm-hmm. And in my experience, obviously, I'm in the early stages of a very high profile murder. But the reason I wrote the book is called The Unveiling, and part of it is dealing with my own grief. But the other real reason of writing it is to lift the veil, lift the curtain of what is happening to families as they go through this justice system. And I think it's a really important point that there's two impacts on the family. Okay, one is we have two descriptions. We're homicide survivors, which is a psychological term, which really deals with the aspects of the sudden, violent finality of the death, and that there are periods in the person's life where those continue to happen, these grief spasms, they call them, and other experiences, because we have no way of ending this loss, because now we're going to switch to the criminal system. And the criminal system is the other side of how it impacts the family. Somebody like myself have been to 2 major trials, sentencing. Now we're having an appeal again for Catherine McBanowa. I'm mentioning this because they have a very large audience that follows the case. So this is just some of the news that they might not have. And so the actual feeling and experience of being a victim is really for the rest of your life. When you have our case, it is really a situation where there's going to be several more trials or several more different things that can happen. We still had a mistrial and so forth. So there's a murder for hire. 3 people already are in prison, just to give Candace a little bit of my backstory. And one person is now in jail, who's a member of the family of my son's ex-wife's family. And we're waiting for a trial to come up sometime in early spring 2023. So we are what I call our experience of being victims. It's a life sentence also, because you never have a chance to breathe. If you finish one trial, that we just went through this, it's sentencing. Then there's a request for bail. Then there's another series of planning hearings and several more trials. And then you shift. So as a victim, this is really important. We started out as a victim with Tallahassee Police Department. They have a very, very, very good victim liaison. We then switched to the state attorney's office, who also has a victim liaison person who's excellent. And now we have, for the appeals, it's another person. So what I'm trying to say is the victim has no real way of continuously getting a lot of support, a lot of information. There has been a very interesting law that actually comes out of California. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Candace. It's called Marcy's Law. And Marcy's Law is all about victims' rights. It's a famous, I forgot his name, from Silicon Valley, who funded this. His sister was murdered by her boyfriend. And he started a victims' rights legislation strategy, actually also grassroots advocacy and so forth. And he's had it passed in many states. So we're in Florida with this, with our current murder situation. And Florida just adopted Marcy's Law in 2019. So that has ways in which the victim should be consulted and so forth. But with all of the sort of public sort of acknowledgement of the victims, it's really not a very well monitored program from the point of view the victim gets lost. Because in our case, it's very glamorous, it's very glitzy. My son was acclaimed, and we have been really, really privileged with a lot of media. 2 sessions of Dateline, 2 hours, to ABC, and multiple media contact. But they're interested really in the crime because of the intrigue of the crime. So the victim is really the backdrop. The family of the victim is really a backdrop to all of, let's call it, the front stage of what's going on. And that's why I actually wrote the book, to really show the public what it's like to be a victim and what are the experiences of going through the trial life.
You, Ruth, also have characteristics of Candace, that you are also an activist, and you are not just lying down and taking it.
She's a doer. I was going to ask Ruth.
Yeah, she's doing.
They're both doers, kind of like me, Carm. I was going to ask you, if Danny was here, what would he say to you about your advocacy, and how impressed would he be with what Candace accomplished?
The fact that, so I should mention to the public and to Candace, so we were cut off from our grandchildren 2 years after visiting them in the initial stages. And so it was for 6 years that we didn't see them. Danny was a phenomenal father. Of all his accomplishments, which were high-level international academic, I'm the most proud of him today, even as a father. So I think that the fact that I fought for his kids, or still fighting, it's not an inactive process, and so forth, he would be very, very happy, because he himself had this, I don't want to say he was anyway like one of these people who only looked out for the underdog, but he was passionate about his interest, which is interesting, such as he was against the death penalty. He's very well known for some of his writing around that kind of an issue. So I think that he would be very pleased with the passion, so to speak, that we all followed. And the fact that, I have to say, I'm not sure, Candace, what's your background, but in our advocacy, I do have to say that we were able to pass grandparent legislation. Really, it's all recent, in 2022. I am not a solo activist. I really had the support of a great champion and community. And, you know, I sat on this initial issue when somebody told me, I'm sitting in Canada 3 years before I did any advocacy, Ruth, you have to write a bill in Florida. Write a bill in Florida. I'm a Canadian. How am I going to do a bill? And then somebody else told me, well, you better get my other friends, all American. You have to get lobbyists. Okay, lobbyists here too, you know. And then we tried to get lobbyists. And then, of course, the person told me, well, it's 2016. We're waiting for an election. Let's wait and see, you know, what's going to happen. So you're, you know, always sort of balancing everything and so forth. But I have to say, after sitting on it for 3 years, which is another important message before I tell you the outcome, when grieving families, many of them, and you probably can share in this, they want to do the initiative, something like you're doing. They want to do a foundation. They want to do some activity to memorialize, right, their child who has been lost to death, let's call it. And many of them don't do it. So I have a message, which is, don't get lost in the loss, LOSS. And the idea being, take incremental steps, and some point it can happen. And that was really my experience. I do say I sat on it. And then in 2019, I was in Tallahassee, which is another point in terms of timing. The main shooter, Garcia, his trial was finished in October. And I was there, and this young woman, Karen Halpern, I always say it ciphers, came up to me as a friend and a hairdresser yet. And she says, can I give you a hug? And I said, yeah. She says, I'm sort of, I could see by her age, she's a friend of Danny and so forth. Anyway, at the very end of it, we went for a coffee, and she says, what can I do for you? And I just blurted out grandparent alienation. And that's, you know, was the start of me really just opening up the sort of horizon, let's call it, to start advocacy. But she created the community. I have to give a lot of credit to the support system that I've had along the way, and just in dealing with the justice issues, but also with the advocacy. And we have a tremendous social media support called Justice for Dan that are just out there all the time. And Karen created a phenomenal movement, let's call it, not a big one, but a community with the lobbyists and so forth. And we passed this legislation.
Along with Jason Solomon as well. That is Justice for Dan Markel. And those guys do a great job, and they help facilitate interviews for people like us to get the word out there. Ruth said, don't get lost in the loss. I love these expressions. I've quoted you since then, Ruth. And there was a quote from Candace that I absolutely love, and it goes something like, kick a few pebbles, turn a few stones, and eventually you have an avalanche.
Let me go back to something Ruth said. So when she talks about being a victim or a survivor, there are a lot of victims that don't like to be called victims. They like to be called survivors. And I use both words. I say victim, survivor. But anyway, one thing that she brought up, and she hasn't yet gotten to that point in her adjudication, but I absolutely hate the word closure. There
Oh,
is
yeah.
no such thing as closure.
Me
Because
too.
especially when you're going through a trial, yes, you get through the trial and then some jerky DA will come out after a sentence and say, now they can get closure. Well, that's not true, because then you go through parole and probation. And I hear from victims in which their driver was prosecuted long ago and now they're up for parole, or they got parole, but now they're going. It's just an ongoing, almost, unless the person is sentenced to death and they go to death right away. It's an ongoing process. It just goes on and on and on.
Let's say the legal part is finished, okay? Finished. But wait a second. Wait 1 second. Wait 1 second. Wait 1 second. The guy who murdered my son is hung, okay? It's still, the pain will be there about my murdered son. So that, in that sense, also he never...
No, but that's grief. And this is just me, my thoughts. And that's grief, and that grief goes on. It's a lifetime process. And it is the beginning, the middle, and the rest of your life. And I want to go back and correct something. When Elizabeth Kubler-Ross first came out with the 5 stages of grieving, it was not for grieving for a loss. It was grief when you've gotten a death sentence for yourself. The stages you go through when you learn that your cancer is terminal or whatever. It didn't apply to people in grief. And that's why I wrote the book, actually, was to counter the myths that went along with that. And grieving is a lifetime process. But what I'm speaking about specifically is the victimization process, in which you're constantly reminded that you're a victim or a survivor each time you get a notice from the DA, or you hear from the parole, or you have to go to probation and testify against the person. That is sort of ongoing. And I didn't know that your son's killer was hung.
That was a figure. That was an example of what, when I thought it was, the legal part was finished. For example, in the Parkland shooter trial that just finished, the parents of the 17 were sitting there, and I couldn't really comprehend what difference would it make if this guy is in prison for life or if he's executed. But I think one of the parents were all devastated that he didn't get the death penalty. And now, listening to you, Candace, I kind of understand, because like this, it's a never ending. You hear about him, you hear his name, you hear he was transferred to another prison, you hear he attacked a guard like he already did. And I begin to understand why these parents don't have even that minimum of finality to...
I guess Candace and Ruth, do you think...
Can I just pipe in here? Because I think
Absolutely.
it's really important. First of all, for me, closure is a word in the dictionary. Mm-hmm. And I say that just straight out. It's not there. I think the expectation, because I also had the death penalty issue, I think they were had too high expectations that when the death penalty was going to be potentially used against Scott Cruz, I think his name is, for the Parkland thing, they never really addressed the fact that there could be a mistrial. There could be, we went through this.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Appeal after appeal. Nobody gets
negative votes. I don't think, and just let me go back to this one point, which maybe you differ with me and so forth. When you're so involved in the criminal system, which takes up so much of your life, and this is not, you see, when you have a trauma, and the trauma has a little bit of what looks like an ending potential, but this is no ending here. And even if the death penalty had been sort of given, or whatever the word is, voted in, I don't believe that's going to solve, and you're just going to move on. It's a really, I don't like 2 words in this whole story. I don't know how you feel, Candace. I don't like the word move on, because I think you can move forward, but not always, like when you're in this criminal system like we are. I don't see this sort of move on as if close the door, move on, closure. Those are all just fairy tales. And I think when you're so involved, like our family still is, in the criminal system. So we haven't yet ended any of the and evidence. Evidence is my mantra today. Like you live these words, and I think that this is really an important point. Until there is some major changes, even in terms of how victims, and I use the word, are maybe supported throughout the process, there is still a tremendous amount of pain. There's a tremendous amount of discomfort, and especially when it's active and it's alive. And I think that's the difference in some of the distinctions.
Well, one of the things I was thinking, that this was almost like a tragically dragged out case. The murder happened in 2014, and today we are at the end of 2022.
And we're not really close
and we
to
are
done.
not even, the main players are still not just like we used to say, the low-hanging fruit. Because what happened is the family hired two small-time crooks to do the actual shooting, but the family was behind the hiring.
Yeah, there's a lot of heads still, obviously, for
so
the
only
Markel
the
family.
two small-time gangsters.
3, including Katie McAnuit.
Yeah,
Catherine
Catherine.
McAnuit.
Yeah.
So, Candace, back to this. I really like this quote about kicking a few pebbles, turning a few stones. Eventually, you have an avalanche. I mean, a lot of people start these grassroots organizations, but what do you think? How are you able to involve literally the world in this? I mean, it wasn't just a small segment of society. We're talking 400 plus chapters around the globe. How did you do that?
I couldn't have done it today with technology and the way technology is today. Wouldn't have happened. But back then, we were such a major cause. I mean, we were killing 25,000 people a year in drunk driving crashes, and that number has now been reduced to about 10,000. But it was such a horrendous number that nobody was really aware of, that all of a sudden we were making people aware of. And then the fact that I was the mother of a child who had been killed, especially by a multiple repeat offender drunk driver, and by the press that we generated. But I did have a strategy. My strategy was to bring attention to this issue on the local, state, and national level. So locally, I went after all the city council members, et cetera, and asked them to form task forces, again, to solve the problem at the local level, whatever it was they were capable of doing to do. Then I went after all the governors of all the states on a state level, again, to form a task force to solve the problem at the state level, which they did, almost all of them did. I was a member of the one in California. Governor Brown did it. So that generated even more attention and even more press because we were looking at solutions for the first time. And then I went after the president, who at that time was Carter, to solve the problem at a national level, and again, to form a presidential commission to solve the problem. Carter was unable to do that because he wasn't reelected, but President Reagan did. And thank God he did. And again, I was a member of that. And that was all around the country, and people came and testified. And it was always big news, and we had some big celebrities involved. So the news was just ongoing until I left. There was always a new story. A victim would start up in New York, and they'd have a story to tell, and the New York press would cover it. Again, that wouldn't happen today. So it was through all that media that people thought, wow, she's getting something done. I want to do that in my state, or I want to do that in my country. I mean, I traveled to Norway, Denmark, France, I can't remember now, Germany, but a number of different countries, again, Brazil, to bring this message to those countries and to help people in those countries get their start in advocacy and doing something about drunk driving. So it really happened through the press.
It's almost like a paradox, because the internet is promoted as the best way to reach the world and get your message out. And what you're saying is that if it were the internet, it wouldn't have happened.
I'm curious. I was going to ask you why. Is it because you think there's just too much noise out, too many other things out there?
That's absolutely one of the reasons. Another reason is because social media is cool and mean. And so people can come out with all kinds of theories and all kinds of conspiracy shit and whatever, excuse my language, but which I didn't have to deal with until I'd been in it about 3 or 4 years. And then, somebody started damn drunk drivers against mad mothers, which actually I thought was funny. But, I just didn't damn DDAM, drunk drivers against mad mothers, DDAMM. And I remember when the press brought me their first newsletter and they're all ready to get me all angry and I started laughing. But whereas now, people would come out the very next day, I believe, because I see it all the time, with snide comments or snarky remarks or conspiracy theories or whatever, which would halt the progress of whatever it is I would be doing. So then I didn't have that. We were sort of pure, this odd word, but we were kind of pure. We were all, families of dead children, dead relatives or whatever. And so it was just seen as a whole different thing. I want to go back to something else when Ruth was talking about words she didn't like. I don't have a problem with words move on, but I do have a problem with the word loss. And I don't say Carrie was lost because I know exactly where she is. Somebody killed her. So if parents want to do that because their children died of illness or whatever, that's one thing. But in our case, my case, where my daughter actually was taken from me by a man who made a dangerous, deadly driving choice, I don't consider her death a loss. I'm trying to think of, how they say, oh, I lost my child. I didn't lose her. I know exactly where she is. So.
And to Candace's point, you don't have to look far. Just look at Alex Jones, what he did to the Sandy Hook families. And that's how people.
And people believe that. I mean, people bought into that. And we have all kinds of people buying into weird things.
And that's the internet. I just want to say a little real side note, but I kind of was figuring this out. When you started the movement in the 80s, right? The population of this country was probably 100 million or 150 million, wasn't 300 million yet. And you had every year 25,000 people killed by drunk driving. Now you have 10,000 a year. The population is double, and the drug problem is also very high, much higher than it was then. And so you should really realize that it's not really 10,000 right now. It's much, much less.
No, I'm actually given credit for saving 600,000 lives. And the guy who put that together were former NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration people. And I can't figure out how they did that, but somehow, they took who should be driving and how, and then came up with, wow, you've saved 600,000 lives. So I think it ties into what you're saying or something,
But, there is the saying, if you saved, probably all religions have this, but I heard it in the Jewish religion, that if you save one life, it's like you saved the whole world.
So Candace has done it 600,000 times.
So you really will go to heaven.
Thank you. But, I think the other thing is, in our case anyway, within 3 years, they were already coming out with the new numbers. And we had dropped deaths and injuries in drunk driving crashes by over 20% in 3 years. So we were able to immediately, practically, show really positive, amazing results, which also helped the cause, I believe, and, increase the press and all of that kind of stuff. Plus, the one thing that we did, we raised the drinking age to 21, which at the time was a history-making bill. Big news, not just in this country, but other countries as well. We fought against the alcohol lobby, major lobby firm, and we were successful. And we were able to raise the drinking age to 21 around the country. So we have these major accomplishments that most groups don't see, and that save lives and just created a whole different culture.
But Ruth, your legislation, which is kind of, I feel like it's the beginning for you of being even continuing to be an activist. This move already changed the lives of a lot of grandparents. I feel like I'm the unofficial. I nominate myself as an unofficial grandparent organization or network or sisterhood, grandmother sisterhood. And did you ever check into it? This new legislation, how many grandparents profited from it by seeing their grandchildren?
Yes, I have to tell you that subsequent to passing the Markel Act, which was in June of 2022, really new, I suddenly got, and I'm not one of these techies who goes inside my phone. If a messenger request comes to me, I see it, but do I go and see how many are there that I'm not involved with on Facebook? And there were tons. So one of the things we did the show, even with Joel and this program in part, where we talked about the grandparents, because they all came out of the woods and asking for help, and they still are coming out. And we have to do a couple more public announcements. It's similar to what you've achieved in certainly not at the same level yet internationally or anything, but we have follow-ups to do. Once you get the advocacy, once you get the success, there's I feel the proper responsibility afterwards to follow through. How do we use the Markel Act? How do we help grandparents, particularly now in Florida, who don't have the actual criteria for the Markel Act, but where do they go for help? Grandparent alienation is one of the biggest social problems right now, and it's very, very big. And yes, there is more room, a lot more room for advocacy, a lot more room, similar to what Candace did, joining up through ARP. There's many organizations, there's many different states where they can benefit from grandparent legislation, and the same thing in Canada. So if I use Candace as my role model, I think I'm going to be busy for the rest of my life with the grandparent issue, and also with going to court. So I'm busy. My number is busy with justice and all this follow through.
It's only going to get busier too, because along with those estimated 600,000 lives that Candace saved, she also helped pass an estimated 750 laws, and the work just keeps going. And now, the same year that Dan was murdered, you founded We Save Lives. I watched a video for that. It's a very eerie video, which you have to go online to watch, but it's essentially a guy who's in prison for...
Reflections from Inside, which was, let me tell you something, that's an amazing video. Well, it's a true story of a young man who was sentenced to prison in Florida. He killed a police officer in Florida, the father of 4, I believe. And the young man was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It took us a year to find the right person to do this video. And he's amazing. And so what happens is you go into a bar. It starts with, first it shows the prison where he's at. And then you see guys going into a bar, and he shows up in the mirror and talks to them. This video has been transcribed into every single language of every single country that ever existed. I didn't even know half these countries existed until they contacted me. It has been seen more than 600 million times around the world, and it focuses on drunk driving, and it's shown in schools. Police use it, driver's ed uses it, and it's absolutely the most phenomenal video. And it's the first time that any organization that I know of went from the victim to the perpetrator. So normally we film victim stories, survivor stories, we focus on them, blah, blah, blah. And this was a real switch because we actually focus on the perpetrator. And I had some real qualms about it at first, but I'm so glad that I got over it, which I did, because this has been so impactful. And if you could have seen at the time when we first launched it, the comments on Facebook were absolutely unbelievable. Now, this time I was very involved in drugged driving. And so, if we put anything about drugged driving, we would get all these comments from people saying, hey, dude, who couldn't spell, by the way. Not true, not as bad as alcohol, etc. When we did this video, the comments were, Mary, you've got to watch this. I told you you shouldn't drive drunk. And Mary would come back and say, oh, you're so right. I won't do that anymore. And that was just all going around. I mean, we had so many comments. I don't even know where they are anymore. There were hundreds and thousands of comments. I couldn't keep up with them from people who had seen the video and of which it had a real impact and made such a difference.
Candace, how much more dangerous have cell phones made driving?
Oh, you know, if you look at drunk driving, it usually is from a 10 to 2, 10 at night to 2 in the morning is when it happens. Cell phones all day. I think people are more addicted to cell phones than they were to alcohol. Well, let me just tell you something. I really hope you don't do this, but Bluetooth, driving with a Bluetooth is like driving with a 0.08 blood alcohol content. So I will go into a room and I'll say to people, you know, how many use, you know, cell phones when they drive? Nobody raises it. How many use Bluetooth? They all raise their hand. And I'll say, how many of you would drive under the influence of alcohol? Oh, no, not me. But you use a Bluetooth. Bluetooths are just as dangerous. And for people who get to a stop sign or a stoplight and think, oh, I can check my messages, it takes you an average of 27 seconds to refocus back on your driving after you've done that. There is nothing safe about a cell phone or Bluetooth while you're driving. Turn it off, put it down, do not disturb, which we actually signed, we actually launched the campaign at Apple to add do not disturb to the iPhones because we had it for the airplanes. You know, we had an airplane thing you could work on. So we said, why not for cars, which they did. Everybody can put do not disturb on their phones. Everybody can do it. And that lets people know you're driving.
And my wife loves it because she puts it on and then
forgets to take it off.
no, she does it on purpose, so I can't reach her. My wife does.
Well, I don't know what she does, but mine goes off automatically. So when I'm out of the car, stopped, it goes off automatically. But I really, really encourage you not to do this because we've had a dramatic increase during the pandemic in pedestrian deaths and other deaths as well, but especially pedestrian deaths. And you know the two main reasons given for that? Speeding and cell phones.
Yeah. If you look around when you drive, everyone is on their phone. Well, everyone except for me. So this is heavy. So far, I've survived. A couple more quick questions. Candace, what advice, pretend that we're not here and our audience is not here and you and Ruth are at a Starbucks talking. What advice would you give to her right now? In terms of that, she's beginning this road, this advocacy road. She obviously
began.
She began it. She's also going through the criminal case. But, you know, she's probably where you were in, let's say, 1983. So, I mean, looking back at yourself in 1983 and knowing how far you've gone in that time, what advice, either in terms of pacing herself or advocating in a certain style, what would you say to her?
Don't get so caught up as I did in this movement that it consumes your life. Make a life for yourself, have some free time, do some fun things, you know, spend time with your family, etc. But definitely make a life for yourself.
That's interesting. Do you feel like you spent too much of your time on all this and did not have it like
Probably 7 days a week, 24. You know, Ralph Nader and I, I'm sorry, he's a famous minister and I can't think of his name. I have brain fog, but
Falwell?
Yeah, I think so. And we were invited on one of the Good Morning America, I think. And so we were asked about being obsessed with our causes. And Ralph actually had the best response. He said, you know, you look at somebody like, and I'm blanking on his name, Steve Jobs, and you don't look at them as being obsessed with Apple or whatever, because you look at them as being entrepreneurial, you know, whatever. And he said, well, we're no different. You know, and this is true. If you're going to be successful as an advocate, you've really got to give it a lot of your time. He said, you know, we're entrepreneurial, which we were and are, I still am. And we've just got a cause instead of a company or a corporation. And I just thought that was a good response. Yes, I was, and I still had children at home. And I don't think I could have done what I did without giving it that kind of time at that time in my life. And I was young and energetic and 100% healthy, and it was easier to do. I wouldn't do that again. And I don't do that now with We Save Lives as much as I love what we do in our campaigns. Because I've seen the harm that comes from it, not just from myself, but from others as well. And I deal with victims, survivors, advocates, and activists all of the time, and not just on drunk driving, but other causes. And I was very involved in the victims' rights movement. I just feel it's really important to give time to yourself, make time for yourself, have a life outside of your advocacy, because someday it may not be there or something can happen and you just need to have a life.
I was going to say, Ruth, do you have anything that you'd like to ask Candace that you'd like to know more about?
I think what she's really talking about, which is a very sort of balanced view of the advocacy with having other interests as well. And I think I appreciate that. I think the harder part for where we're at right now is you can have other interests, and we do, but the criminal system, because we are so personally involved in it,
And you should
is very time consuming. It's different too.
I tell victims a lot, because when I get contacted by them to help with their cases, you really need to be your own advocate in today's world. And not everybody has the kind of support that Ruth does. We don't all have victim advocates, that help us with the criminal justice system or from the DA's office. Or I know, because I get contacted by victims who don't have this kind of support. So, and I encourage them and teach them how to be their own advocate, which in many cases they need to be. But at some point in time, you have to make a decision about what's best for you individually. And that's when you start thinking about the kind of life that you want to have for you. I mean, if this is your life, and I've seen this happen. I actually was asked to speak by a number of psychologists on the founder syndrome, because I am a founder. If this becomes everything you do and think about, it's not a good thing. It's just not a good thing for you individually. Anyway, that's just.
Candace, what do you think Carrie would say to you today?
Oh, beats me. I was just 13. Yeah, probably good for you, Mom. I've said she was the oldest of the twins by 4 minutes. And, but she would still have that sort of older mentality. And I've often said that if it happened to me, she would be doing this. And I believe that. She was a real fighter, that little girl. Just really a fighter. And so I think she'd be doing the same thing. And I think and I believe in an afterlife, and I've experienced her afterlife. So I think she's just out there going, good for you, yay, yay, yay.
I have a question, Candace. When you refer a lot to the victims groups that you're familiar with and so on, are you talking about like organized victim organizations? Mm-hmm. Or yes? Mm-hmm.
I am both organized and unorganized. And by the way, the law did you pass it in Florida?
Yes. And we had lobbyists too.
Yeah, we should have contacted me. But I get a lot of calls and emails, et cetera, from grandparents who no longer have the right or ability to see their grandchildren as a result of usually a traffic crash. And which is the saddest story. In fact, I tried to get a friend of mine who not only continues to see his granddaughter after his son was killed, but when his daughter-in-law remarried, he actually walked her down the aisle. I mean, just the most beautiful story of a wonderful relationship. And I asked Ed one time, I said, why don't you do a blog for me on all the positive benefits, of being able to still have a relationship with your granddaughter. But he's heavily involved because his son was killed by a drug driver. So he's heavily involved in that movement. But I do know, I think, Ruth, I'm not positive, but that others have told me they too have worked on legislation similar to what I think you're talking about in other states. I don't know if it's passed or not, because this is not just from people who have murdered, victims. They're from other, even people who died of cancer and no longer, where their son-in-law or daughter died and no longer have access to the grandchildren. Such a shame. So I think this is something really important that other people are doing and need to do.
No, I think it's really the beginning of like you say, another whole movement. There is something called Alienated Grandparents Anonymous. Mm-hmm. So those are like chapters, to meet. But in terms of really making and change in legislation and so forth, I think there could be. We could even be part of your We Saved Lives. You talk about coalitions as part of really, making things happen and so forth. But
it's an important issue, by the way. I do, and I support you 100% on doing that. And it's too bad you use law. I mean, I never used a lobbyist. I don't think in all of the bills that I passed and I'm still introducing and passing bills up until recently, and they haven't used a lobbyist. But no, I think it's a good thing to do. It's like as Martha Stewart would say, it's a good thing to do.
I have a feeling you guys are going to be talking quite a bit. Just one more thing for me. By the way, Carm, 600 million views. Talked about anger. That got me angry, and it's also getting me motivated. So we're going full circle here. But to end on 600 million views for that We Save Lives video, that's impressive. A final question. I've almost survived this. I wasn't sure I was going to, but I surviving the survivor. These are 3 tough women. Final question, Carm, and I'm going to ask all of you the same question. You're 83. You're the oldest. You take the lead here. What is important in life?
Well, Candace mentioned some of the important things, and I tend to agree with it. You have to have a cause that you are passionate about, and you have to know how to pace it so that you are not consumed or burned out by it or destroyed by it. And you have to find a balance in life too.
Ruth, what's important in life, Ruth?
I agree with that. I think the balance, and I'm going to talk about celebration also. One of the things, as my grandchildren would have their bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, and then this is also dating us, but if you remember Pete Seeger, there's a time to laugh and a time to cry. And I think for all of the seriousness that we all are engaged in, that we shouldn't forget the times to laugh and the times to enjoy celebration. So it's not just the issue of having a life outside of these causes, but really an opportunity to be able to enjoy, because I think that's another part of a message, which is really to be able to enjoy life, not just to have a life, but to enjoy the life that you do have. Candace?
From a cause perspective, passenger safety, which I am really passionate about. And what's important to me personally is my new puppy, who's a Maltese, and the cutest thing you've ever seen in your life. And he's 6 months old. And I love him to death. And I just did a whole blog on dog restraints because I can't stand it when I see people who allow their dogs to hang out the windows. So he's sort of the bright light into my life. I'm going through what I call the empty nest syndrome because my grandkids are all grown now and they all work and they all have this and they all have that. I don't see them anymore. So now I have Cuddles in my life and he makes up for it.
Carm, I'm going to get you a Maltese. Candace, you bring up, now I love you even more because you care about dogs. My Mabel Rose turned 17 in January, and he
had her before he got married.
He
raised her from 6 weeks, and I never hear enough about
I have
Mabel.
To go home and literally inject her with an IV. She's got some kidney issues, which I will do for her.
We had a dog, but those are hard issues too.
Yeah, it's brutal because they're so I don't know, they depend on you so much. Candace, I lied. One last question: why had they not made a big blockbuster movie about you, and when will Meryl Streep play you in a film? When's that happening?
As you know, they already did years ago. That was up for 2 Emmys. I actually went to the Emmy Awards. It was quite interesting. I think I'm old news now, and I had several people approach me for a documentary, but it never got off the ground. I just think I'm old news. So my thing now is developing the master classes for the Mentora Institute because I'm an ongoing guest lecturer there.
And if people are interested in that, in the master class, where do they go to find more about it?
Probably they can actually tell them to sign up at my website, CandaceLightner.com. Because the Mentora Institute isn't yet taking it because I've just completed them. They have to be taped and all of that kind of stuff. So if they sign up for CandaceLightner.com, my website, which they can sign up on, I will keep them posted as to when they're ready to go. And they'll be recorded. And then I'll be doing some interactive stuff too.
And of course, Ruth's book, The Unveiling. I'll never get the subtitle without notes in front of me. Ruth, full title?
The full title is A Mother's Reflection on murder, grief, and trial life. And I'll put a plug in. It's available now in print, digital, and audio. And it's you can get it through Amazon and some of the big bookstores like Barnes and Nobles in Canada, Indigo. So we're all in marketing mode now.
Go out and buy it. The Unveiling. And Carm, you're behind the 8 ball. You're the oldest, and we're still working on our book. It'll be out soon, and everyone can get it. If you want to subscribe to our newsletter,
I'm still young.
you're still young. Put your email in the comment section. We'll get you in a newsletter. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. Candace Lightner, you bring light to life and have saved 600,000 people. You're going to go to the afterlife for many,
A lot of lights.
As many generations as Jeff Bezos' family won't need money, you'll have that much in the afterlife. A lot.
Oh,
Thank you,
so
guys.
much.
Thank you. Love you, America.
It's a
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming
Love
on
you.
our show. Thank you.